Today I'd like to continue our journey through the Gospel of Matthew in the 8th chapter. In this particular section, starting today about verse 20, we're taking a look at some of the difficulties that we encounter when we're trying to follow Jesus, that Jesus is challenging us about if you want to follow him, it might wind up that you're homeless and you might have a lot of difficulties, a lot of challenges. In verse 21 of chapter 8, another of the disciples of Jesus comes up and says, Lord, let me go first and bury my father. In other words, I want to follow you, but I've got this obligation to, bury my father. Jesus says to him in verse 22, his rejoinder is, follow me and let the dead bury their dead. When you first hear that, Jesus, wow, this seems very stringent. How can the dead, first of all, bury their dead? How's that going to happen? And, isn't that kind of cruel? I mean, to be there to bury your father. Burying the dead in the Jewish and Hellenistic traditions, in both traditions, was a very strong filial obligation. The idea was this was part of your normal everyday existence. This burying the dead, this was considered something that everybody would do. The father, though, when you look at it a little bit closely, the father was not actually dead. It wasn't like the fellow was going to go and bury the father right away. Usually, the dead were buried within a day. This was something that happened immediately. It wasn't like our situations today where we sometimes wait a few days and then have a service, that type of thing. No, the dead were buried immediately within a 24-hour time period. So most likely this father is not really deceased. The disciple would have had to stay at home and wait for the father to die. And we don't have any indication from this disciple that the father is very sick or this is going to be an immediate thing. This could be something that could be months or even years in the making, this idea of, burying my father. If we as disciples waited for all of these filial obligations and family responsibilities to be satisfied, maybe we're not going to be disciples at all. It's, well, I have to bury my mother, and my sister is sick, and this, In other words, Jesus is saying, well, wait a minute here. If you want to follow me, but if not, I understand. That means that this person is looking at not following Jesus by way of excuse. And of course, I think it's something we can all relate to. Well, I'll follow Jesus this day, but I have a lot of other things to do on this day, or I'll forget about, the excuse making as to why it's not practical for me to follow Jesus. But if Jesus is the center of our lives, if Jesus is our Lord, if he is our God, we want to follow him all the time, in every circumstance of our life. We want to follow him completely and totally, and not hold back. And so what at first seems kind of harsh, when you unpack it, I think there's a different sense of it. We see this strong obligation to bury the dead, of course, in the book of Tobit. Tobit chapter 1, verses 16 to 20 says, during Shalmaneser's reign, I performed many charitable works for my kinsmen and my people. So a very charitable person. I would give my bread to the hungry. Beautiful. My clothing to the naked. These things which we see as the corporal works of mercy he was doing. If I saw one of my people who died and had been thrown outside the walls of Nineveh, sometimes the dead would just be thrown outside the walls and there'd be no special celebration of their death, especially in a city where the Jewish people were not really welcomed, like Nineveh. Tobit says, I would bury him. I also buried anyone whom Sennacherib slew when he returned as a fugitive from Judea during the days of judgment decreed against him by the heavenly king, because of the blasphemies he had uttered. So Sennacherib was not too well liked because of his attitude and his anti-Jewish feelings and not having respect for the Jewish religion. In his rage, he killed many Israelites, Sennacherib. But I used to take their bodies by stealth and bury them. So Sennacherib would kill them, but Tobit would go and try and get the bodies so he could bury them, give them a proper burial. But a certain citizen, of Nineveh was looking for these bodies because Sennacherib, could not find them. And he informed the king, this citizen of Nineveh, that it was I, Tobit, who buried the dead. When I found out that the king knew all about me, that he had buried the dead and wanted to put me to death, I went into hiding. Then, in my fear, I took to flight, trying to get away from Sennacherib, because obviously Sennacherib did not like what he was doing in burying the dead, and wanted to put him to death. Afterward, all my property was confiscated. I was left with nothing. So Tobit really puts his life and his property and his whole relationships in terms of the family and his community, put that all on the line for his belief in giving the dead a proper burial. All that I had was taken to the king's palace. So the king was like, hey, I can't get him. I don't know where he is, but let me take all of his money and all of his goods, except for my wife Anna and my son Tobiah. So they were spared. In 1 Kings 19:20, again, we see this. Elisha left the oxen, ran after Elijah, and said, please let me kiss my father and mother goodbye, and I will follow you. You just have to kiss them goodbye. Elijah answered, have I done anything to you? Elisha then slaughters his oxen and follows Elijah. He doesn't hold back. He wanted to spend more time with his family, but to follow Elijah, if he was really sincere about it, meant a full commitment. So in all of these examples, you see what is Jesus saying to this disciple. Jesus isn't against the idea of burying the dead. As a matter of fact, in the discourse in Matthew 25, Jesus talks about our obligation to bury the dead, and Jesus, of course, reverences that. We see that with his encounters with Lazarus and the son of the widow of Nain, and the daughter, Jairus' daughter, who he raised. So Jesus certainly has a legitimate and very important respect for burying the dead. What Jesus is saying here really is in terms of our commitment. Whom are we going to put first in our lives? Are we truly sincere in following Jesus? Or is this just something like, oh, I'll follow Jesus when it's convenient. I'll follow Jesus when it's easy. Or do I give myself completely to follow Jesus? And this is a challenge for all of us. There's a tendency always to hold back. Say, well, maybe another day, maybe another time. But what Jesus is telling us is, if you want to follow me, follow me completely, follow me totally. Give your life to me as I have given my life for you. This, I think, becomes a real challenge for all of us. How much are we willing to give and following.